The first time Lyra Ashford saw him, he was standing in the ruins of the old monastery, moonlight threading silver through his dark hair like a crown. She had come to paint the crumbling stones, another commission for the tourism board, another landscape to capture the mystical beauty of Raven's Hollow for postcards and brochures. But the moment her eyes found his silhouette against the Gothic arches, every rational thought fled her mind. He moved like liquid shadow, graceful and predatory, examining the ancient walls with reverent fingers. Even from her hiding spot behind a fallen pillar, she could see the otherworldly beauty that marked him as different, the sharp angles of his face, the way starlight seemed to gather in his pale eyes, the unconscious power that radiated from his tall frame. Lyra's hand found her sketchbook without conscious thought, charcoal dancing across paper as she tried to capture what couldn't possibly be captured. The way wildness and nobility warred in his features, the dangerous elegance that made her pulse quicken with equal parts fear and fascination. A twig snapped under her foot. He turned, and their eyes met across 30 feet of moonlit ruin. Time crystallized, sharp and breathless, as those pale eyes, wolf eyes, her mind whispered, fixed on her with predatory focus. She expected him to flee, to vanish like the wild creature he resembled. Instead, he smiled, slow and knowing, as if he'd been waiting for her all along. An artist, he said, voice carrying easily across the distance, rich with an accent she couldn't place. How long have you been watching me? Heat flooded her cheeks. I was just sketching. He moved closer with that fluid grace, and she caught his scent on the night breeze, pine and moonlight and something indefinably wild. May I see? She should have said no. Should have made excuses and fled back to her cottage with its safe electric lights and locked doors. Instead, she found herself holding out the sketchbook with trembling fingers, watching as he studied her hasty lines with impossible intensity. You see more than most, he murmured, tracing the air above her drawing as if afraid to touch it. Tell me, what do you see when you look at me? The question hung between them, loaded with meaning she didn't understand. Lyra studied his face in the moonlight, the aristocratic nose, the full mouth that hinted at both cruelty and tenderness, the eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who couldn't be older than 30. Beauty, she said honestly. And danger. And... She hesitated, then plunged ahead. Sadness. Like you're carrying something too heavy for one person to bear. Something flickered across his features, surprise, pain, and something that might have been hope. He was silent for so long she wondered if she'd offended him. Then he handed back her sketchbook with careful reverence. I am Kieran Blackthorne, he said formally, executing a bow that belonged to another century. And you, artist who sees too much, are? Lyra Ashford. She tucked the sketchbook against her chest like armor. I'm sorry for intruding. I didn't realize anyone else came here at night. His smile turned rueful. I prefer the darkness. Daylight and I have never been compatible. There was something in the way he said it, a weight that suggested deeper meaning. Lyra found herself leaning forward, drawn by the mystery of him despite every instinct screaming that Kieran Blackthorne was dangerous in ways she couldn't begin to fathom. Are you from Raven's Hollow? She asked. In a manner of speaking. His fingers drummed against his thigh, restless energy barely contained. My family has interests here. Ancient ones. The monastery bells, long silent, chose that moment to chime midnight. The sound rolled across the ruins like a death knell, and Kieran's entire body went rigid. His nostrils flared, and when he looked at her again, something had changed in his eyes, something wild and hungry that made her take an involuntary step backward. You should go, he said, voice rough with sudden strain. Now. I don't understand. Go. The word came out as a snarl, and for a heartbeat she glimpsed something inhuman flickering beneath his beautiful features. Please. Lyra ran. She fled through the ruins and down the winding path, her art supplies clutched against her chest, heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, a sound echoed through the night, part scream, part howl, entirely inhuman. She didn't stop running until she reached her cottage, deadbolting the door with shaking hands. Only then did she realize she was still clutching her sketchbook, the drawing of Kieran Blackthorne staring back at her with eyes that seemed to follow her movement. Outside, something held at the moon, wild and mournful and utterly, impossibly beautiful. Lyra spent the next 3 days trying to forget Kieran Blackthorne. She threw herself into work, finishing a watercolor series of Ravensshallow's Harbour, organizing her supplies, even deep cleaning her cottage studio until the windows gleamed and every brush stood at perfect attention. But no amount of busy work could erase the memory of pale eyes and that final, desperate warning. "You should go. Now." What had he been running from? Or more disturbing, what had he been trying to protect her from? On the 4th morning, a knock at her door shattered her determined normalcy. She opened it to find an elderly man in an impeccable black suit, silver hair combed back from a face that spoke of old-world manners and carefully guarded secrets. "Miss Ashford? I am Aldrich Thorpe, in service to the Blackthorne family." His voice carried the same indefinable accent she'd heard in Kieran's speech. "My employer wishes to commission a painting." Lyra's mouth went dry. "Kieran sent you?" Something flickered in the old man's eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she knew the name. "Indeed. Prince Kieran has specific requirements for this commission." "May I come in?" "Prince?" The word lodged in her throat as she stepped aside, mind reeling. She'd known there was something aristocratic about Kieran, but an actual prince? Thorpe entered her cottage with the measured steps of a man accustomed to grand estates, though his gaze swept her modest studio with apparent approval. "Charming," he murmured. "Very intimate. What kind of painting does he want?" Lyra asked, finding her voice. "A portrait." Thorpe's expression revealed nothing. "The subject matter will be unique. The compensation, however, will be substantial." He produced an envelope from his jacket. "This is merely the advance." Lyra opened the envelope and nearly dropped it. The check inside bore more zeros than she typically saw in a year. "This is too much. Prince Kieran values exceptional artistry. Your reputation precedes you, Miss Ashford." Thorpe paused meaningfully. "As does your discretion. I haven't agreed to anything yet." "Of course. But perhaps you would consider meeting with Prince Kieran this evening? To discuss the parameters of the commission?" Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings. Mysterious aristocrats, enormous payments, meetings shrouded in secrecy, it sounded like the beginning of a cautionary tale. But the artist in her, the part that lived for challenge and beauty and the chance to capture something extraordinary, was already reaching for her coat. "Where?" she heard herself ask. "Blackthorne Manor. I'll send a car at sunset." After Thorpe left, Lyra stared at the check until the numbers blurred. She could pay off her student loans, buy proper equipment, maybe even afford to exhibit in the city galleries she'd dreamed about since art school. All for one painting. But it wasn't the money that made her decision, and she was honest enough to admit it. It was the memory of Kieran in the moonlight, beautiful and dangerous and heartbreakingly alone. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever had driven him to flee that night, she wanted to understand. More than that, she wanted to paint him. The car that arrived at sunset was a gleaming black sedan with tinted windows and a driver who spoke only in respectful nods. They wound through Ravensshallow's narrow streets and up into the hills, where ancient oak trees formed a canopy so thick that twilight fell like a curtain. When they finally stopped, Lyra found herself staring up at a mansion that belonged in a Gothic novel. Blackthorne Manor rose from the landscape like something carved from the night itself, all sharp angles and soaring towers against the darkening sky. Gargoyles perched on the corners, their stone eyes following her movement as she walked to the massive front doors. Everything about the place whispered of old money, older secrets, and power that stretched back through centuries. Thorpe greeted her at the entrance, leading her through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to track her passage. The artwork was museum quality, Renaissance masters, rare tapestries, sculptures that probably belonged in the Louvre. But it was the recurring motif that caught her attention: wolves. Carved in stone, woven in silk, painted in oils, they appeared everywhere, watching from shadows and moonlight with familiar pale eyes. "Prince Kieran will see you in the study," Thorpe announced, stopping before an intricately carved door. "He asks that you remember. He is not quite himself after dark." Before Lyra could ask what that meant, the door opened, and Kieran Blackthorn stood silhouetted against firelight like a figure from a dream. If Kieran had been beautiful in moonlight, by firelight he was devastating. The warm glow softened the sharp edges of his face while somehow enhancing the otherworldly quality that marked him as different. He wore black as if it were a second skin, the expensive fabric molding to broad shoulders and a lean frame that spoke of barely leashed power. Lyra. Her name on his lips sounded like a caress. "Thank you for coming." She stepped into the study, immediately overwhelmed by its grandeur. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes in languages she couldn't identify. The 4th wall was dominated by an enormous fireplace where flames danced over logs that smelled of pine and something mysteriously sweet. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and everywhere she looked, more wolf motifs watched from the shadows. "Your home is..." She searched for words that wouldn't sound inadequate. "Incredible." "My prison," he said quietly, then seemed to catch himself. "Forgive me. Would you care for wine? Something stronger?" Wine would be lovely. She needed something to steady her nerves, to make sense of the way her pulse quickened every time he looked at her. He moved to a sideboard carved with intricate wolf heads, pouring deep red wine into crystal glasses. When he handed her the goblet, their fingers brushed, and she felt electricity arc between them like a living thing. His nostrils flared slightly, and she wondered if he'd felt it too. "Thorpe said you want to commission a portrait," she said, settling into a leather chair that probably cost more than her car. "Yes and no." Kieran remained standing, pacing to the fireplace with restless energy. "What I want, Miss Ashford, is far more complex than a simple portrait." "I don't understand." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions she couldn't fathom. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, each word chosen with precision. "Tell me, what do you know of curses?" The question caught her off guard. "Curses? As in, fairy tale curses?" "As in ancient magic. Bloodline magic. The kind that binds a man to his worst nature and steals his humanity piece by piece." His laugh held no humor. "The kind that transforms princes into monsters." Lyra's grip tightened on her wineglass. "Kieran, what are you talking about?" He turned to face her, and in the firelight his eyes held flecks of gold that hadn't been there before. "I'm talking about the reason I can only meet you after dark. The reason I live in isolation, attended by servants who understand the unique challenges of my condition. I'm talking about the curse that has plagued my family for 3 centuries. This is crazy." But even as she said it, she remembered the inhuman sound that had echoed through the monastery ruins, the way he'd warned her to run, the predatory grace that marked every movement. "Is it?" He moved closer, and she caught that wild scent again, pine and moonlight and something that made her hindbrain whisper danger. "You're an artist, Lyra. You see what others miss. What do your instincts tell you about me?" She studied his face, noting the slight elongation of his canines, the way shadows seemed to gather around him like living things, the barely contained energy that thrummed beneath his civilized exterior. Everything logical screamed that he was delusional, possibly dangerous. But the artist in her, the part that dealt in truth and beauty and the spaces between reality and dream, recognized something deeper. "You're not entirely human," she whispered. "No." The admission seemed to cost him. "Not anymore." "What are you?" "A werewolf. The last prince of a dying bloodline, bound to a curse that grows stronger with each passing generation." He laughed bitterly. "I know how it sounds. But every full moon, I lose myself completely. I become something savage, something that would kill without conscience or memory. And each transformation takes a little more of my humanity with it." Lyra set down her wine with trembling hands. Why are you telling me this? Because I need your help. He knelt beside her chair, and she could see the desperation he'd been hiding behind aristocratic composure. The curse can be broken, but only under very specific circumstances. It requires a willing heart, an artistic soul, and... He hesitated. A painting created under the light of the full moon. A painting of what? Of me. Both sides of me. Human and wolf, man and monster. The painting must capture the truth of what I am, bind both natures together on canvas. If it succeeds, the curse breaks. If it fails. What happens if it fails? His eyes met hers, ancient and achingly sad. Then I lose my humanity forever. And the artist who attempts the binding. He swallowed hard. The magic will consume them as well. The study fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Lyra's mind reeled, trying to process the impossible choice he was offering. Paint a cursed werewolf prince under the full moon, with her life as the stakes. It was insane, suicidal, the premise of a nightmare rather than a commission. But when she looked at Kieran, really looked at him, she saw something that made her heart ache. Loneliness. Bone-deep, soul-crushing loneliness that spoke of centuries spent in isolation, watching his humanity slip away piece by piece. The full moon is in 3 days, she said quietly. Yes. And if I agree to this, if I try to paint you and fail, we both die? The magic would claim us both. His voice was steady, but she could see the hope and terror warring in his eyes. I won't lie to you, Lyra. The risk is enormous. But you're the first person in decades who's seen me, really seen me. If anyone can capture the truth of what I am. Why me? There have to be other artists, more experienced ones. Because, he said simply, you're the first person to look at me and see beauty alongside the beast. Most people see only the monster, or only the man. You see both, and you're not afraid. He was wrong about the fear. She was terrified, heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. But beneath the terror was something else, a pull she couldn't name, a certainty that felt like destiny. I need time to think, she managed. Of course. He rose gracefully, moving back to the fireplace. But Lyra, time is the one thing I don't have much of. With each full moon, the wolf grows stronger. This may be my last chance to break free. She stood on unsteady legs, the weight of his confession settling around her like a cloak. At the study door, she paused, looking back at him silhouetted against the flames. If I do this, she said, if I agree to paint you, I want complete honesty between us. No more secrets, no half-truths. If we're risking our lives together, I need to know everything. Something like relief flickered across his features. Everything, he promised. I swear it on what's left of my soul. Outside Blackthorn Manor, the driver waited to take her home. But as the car pulled away, Lyra found herself staring back at the gothic silhouette against the stars, knowing that whatever choice she made would change everything. In 3 days, the moon would be full. In 3 days, she would have to decide whether love and art were worth dying for. Lyra didn't sleep that night. She paced her cottage studio, Kieran's words echoing through her mind like an incantation, the magic will consume them as well. Every rational thought screamed at her to pack her bags, leave Raven's Hollow, and never look back. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in the firelight, beautiful and damned and heartbreakingly hopeful. By dawn, she'd made her choice. She spent the morning researching everything she could find about werewolf legends, surprised to discover how consistent the stories were across cultures. The curse of the wolf was always tied to the full moon, always involved a loss of humanity, and almost always ended in tragedy. But buried in the oldest texts, she found references to breaking such curses through art, paintings that could bind split souls, sculptures that could heal divided hearts. Let the willing hand of an artist true capture both beast and man in one view. Only when the monster and human are seen as whole can the cursed soul regain control. The rhyme appeared in a 15th-century grimoire, written in faded Latin that she had to translate line by line. Below it, a marginal note in different handwriting: 3 have tried. 3 have failed. The painting consumed by flame, the artists consumed by magic. 3 failures. 3 deaths. Her phone rang at noon, jarring her from her research. Thorpe's cultured voice filled her kitchen. "Miss Ashford? Prince Kieran wishes to know if you've reached a decision." "Tell him yes," she heard herself say. "But I have conditions." "Of course. He will see you this evening to discuss arrangements." That afternoon, Lyra gathered her supplies with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle. Her finest brushes, imported from Germany. Tubes of paint in colors that seemed to glow with their own light. Cadmium yellow like captured sunlight, ultramarine blue deep as midnight, titanium white pure as fresh snow. And canvas. She selected her largest, finest piece, a surface big enough to capture the full truth of whatever Kieran Blackthorne really was. As the sun set, she found herself back at Blackthorne Manor, her supplies carefully packed in the back seat of the black sedan. This time, Thorpe led her not to the study but to a different wing of the house, up a winding stone staircase that felt older than the rest of the building. "The tower room," he explained as they climbed. "Prince Kieran had it specially prepared for your work." The room that greeted her took her breath away. It was circular, with tall windows that would flood the space with moonlight. Someone had installed professional lighting equipment, LED panels that could simulate natural light, adjustable stands for different angles. An easel stood ready, and a small table held water containers, palette knives, and everything else she might need. But it was the bed in the corner that made her pause. Not a normal bed, but something that looked like it belonged in a medieval dungeon, heavy wooden frame with iron shackles attached to each corner. "For the transformation," Thorpe said quietly, following her gaze. "Prince Kieran becomes unpredictable when the change begins. The restraints are for your protection as much as his." Lyra swallowed hard, reality crashing over her in cold waves. This wasn't some romantic fantasy. In 2 days, she would be locked in this room with a werewolf, trying to paint both his human and animal sides while he underwent a transformation that might drive him to kill her. Having second thoughts? Kieran's voice came from the doorway, and she turned to find him watching her with those 2 knowing eyes. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. "But I'm still here." He entered the room, moving to the windows that looked out over moonlit grounds. "I've spent the day making arrangements. If something goes wrong, if the magic turns against us, Thorpe has instructions to ensure your family is compensated." "Stop." Lyra crossed to him, surprised by her own boldness. "Don't talk like we've already failed. 3 others have tried, Lyra. 3 others have died. Then we'll have to be better than they were." She squared her shoulders, channeling every ounce of determination she possessed. "Tell me about the other artists. What went wrong?" Kieran was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gardens where topiary wolves seemed to prowl in the shadows. "The first was a court painter, commissioned by my great-great-grandfather in 1847. He was technically skilled but saw only the surface, painted the man beautifully but couldn't capture the wolf. The painting caught fire the moment the transformation began." "And the second?" "A woman, about 40 years ago. She had talent, real gift for seeing beyond the physical. But she was terrified of the beast, painted it as pure monster. The canvas split down the middle, and the magic." He shuddered. "She screamed for 3 days before it finally took her." Lyra's mouth went dry. "The third?" "A young man, just 15 years ago. He was fearless, fascinated by the supernatural. He painted the wolf magnificently, captured every detail of fang and claw and wild beauty. But he couldn't see the humanity that remained. The painting showed only animal, and when the moon reached its peak." "What happened?" "I killed him." The words were barely a whisper. "In my wolf form, I tore him apart. Because without his human soul bound to the painting, I was nothing but beast." They stood in silence, the weight of history pressing down like a physical thing. 3 attempts, 3 failures, 3 deaths. And now here she was, arrogant enough to think she could succeed where others had failed. "I won't lie and say I'm not afraid," she said finally. "But I'm here because I see something different when I look at you. Not man or wolf, but both. Maybe that's what the others missed. And if you're wrong? Then we die together." She turned to face him fully, struck again by the impossible beauty that radiated from his tortured features. "But if I'm right, if I can capture the truth of what you are, then maybe we both get to live." He studied her face in the moonlight, and she saw the moment when desperation gave way to something deeper. Hope. Fragile as spun glass, but real. "Tomorrow night, I'll explain exactly what happens during the transformation," he said. "And I'll tell you about the binding ritual, what words must be spoken, what symbols must be painted. But tonight." He moved closer, and she caught his wild scent again. "Tonight, let me show you the human side. Let me give you something worth saving." His hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. "You're extraordinary, Lyra Ashford. And if we survive this, if the curse breaks and I'm free, I want to spend whatever time I have left learning every detail of your beautiful mind." She leaned into his touch, heart hammering with more than fear. "And if we don't survive? Then at least I'll die as a man, not a monster." His lips brushed her forehead in a kiss soft as moonlight. "Thank you for giving me that gift." As he walked her back through the manor's shadowed halls, Lyra realized she was no longer thinking about the commission or the money or even the curse. She was thinking about the way Kieran moved like liquid grace, the loneliness that haunted his pale eyes, and the impossible gentleness in hands that could tear her apart. Tomorrow night, she would learn the final details of their deadly bargain. But tonight, she was falling in love with a man who might not survive to love her back. The next evening arrived with unseasonable warmth, as if summer had returned for one final, desperate kiss before winter claimed Raven's Hollow. Lyra found herself in Blackthorn Manor's gardens, where Kieran had promised to show her the human side worth saving. She'd expected another formal meeting in his study. Instead, she discovered him by a fountain where stone wolves eternally hunted stone deer, sleeves rolled up in dirt under his fingernails. "You garden?" she asked, surprised by this mundane detail. "I try to create life," he said, not looking up from the rosebushes he was tending. "It helps me remember what I'm fighting to preserve." She studied the garden with new eyes, noting how carefully tended everything was despite the wild, overgrown appearance. Moonflowers climbed the ancient walls, their white blooms opening to release perfume into the night air. Herbs grew in neat rows. Lavender, rosemary, things that smelled of comfort and home. And everywhere, roses. Deep red blooms that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "They're beautiful," she murmured. "They're the only things that survive my transformations." He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Every month, I wake up to find the garden destroyed, except for the roses. They bend but never break. Like you." He smiled, sad and grateful. "I'd like to think so." He gestured toward a stone bench position to catch the fountain spray. "Sit with me? There are things you need to know before tomorrow night." They settled beside each other, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. In the garden's peace, surrounded by growing things and the gentle sound of water, it was almost possible to forget the supernatural danger that stalked them both. "Tell me about your family," she said. "How did the curse begin?" "With a broken promise, as these things usually do." Kieran plucked a white rose, turning it over in his long fingers. "My ancestor, the first Prince Kieran, was a proud man. Too proud. A witch offered him a bargain, protection for his lands in exchange for sanctuary for her people. He agreed, took her power, used it to build this estate and establish our wealth. But when her enemies came hunting, when she needed the sanctuary he'd promised, he betrayed her. Worse. He handed her over to be burned." The rose stem snapped between his fingers. With her dying breath, she cursed him and all his bloodline. "Let those who break faith with the innocent become beasts themselves," losing more of their humanity with each full moon until nothing remains but hunger and rage. Lyra shivered despite the warm air. How many generations? 7, including me. It grows stronger each time it passes down, harder to control. My great-grandfather could maintain some awareness during the transformation. My grandfather remembered fragments. My father. Kieran's voice went hollow. He died trying to fight it. Threw himself from the tower rather than risk hurting my mother. And you? I remember nothing. When the moon reaches its peak, Kieran Blackthorn ceases to exist. Only the wolf remains, and it knows only hunger. He looked at her with eyes full of ancient pain. Do you understand now why the others failed? How do you paint humanity in something that has none? Because it's still there, she said fiercely. Hidden, maybe. Buried deep. But still there. You tend roses, Kieran. You read poetry and collect art and worry about hurting innocent people. That's not the behavior of a monster. Pretty words. But she could see hope flickering in his expression. I pray you're right. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fountain and the night sounds of the garden. When she finally spoke, it was to ask the question that had been haunting her since their first meeting. Why haven't you tried to break the curse before? Surely there have been other opportunities. There have been. But the binding ritual requires more than just artistic skill. He turned to face her fully, and she saw vulnerability raw in his features. It requires love, Lyra. True, willing, absolute love between the artist and the subject. Without that emotional connection, the painting is just canvas and pigment. Her breath caught. Love? The 3 who died, they saw me as a curiosity, a challenge, a chance for fame or fortune. But love? He laughed bitterly. How do you love a monster? You're not a monster. The words came out fierce, certain. You're a man trapped in an impossible situation, fighting every day to hold on to his humanity. That's not monstrous, that's heroic. Lyra. He reached for her hand, fingers intertwining with hers. What I feel for you, what's growing between us, it's real. But you have to know that tomorrow night, the man sitting beside you will disappear. In his place will be something that would kill you without hesitation if given the chance. Then we make sure it doesn't get the chance. She squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from the contact. Tell me about the ritual. What exactly happens? The transformation begins at moonrise and peaks at midnight. That's when you'll need to paint, when both natures are present, struggling for dominance. The painting must be completed by dawn, and it must show the truth of what I am. Both sides, bound together in perfect balance. And the words? You mentioned words that must be spoken. An incantation in the old tongue. I'll teach it to you tonight, make sure you know it perfectly. But Lyra. His grip tightened. The most dangerous part comes at the end. To complete the binding, to seal the curse's breaking, you'll need to touch the painting while speaking the final words. And at that moment, you'll be completely vulnerable. If the magic fails, if I'm still lost to the wolf, you'll kill me. She said it matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. Yes. Then I guess I'll have to make sure the magic doesn't fail. They rose together, moving back toward the manor as the first stars appeared overhead. Tomorrow night, everything would change, one way or another. But tonight, Kieran was simply a man who tended roses and spoke of love with heartbreaking honesty. At the manor's entrance, he stopped, turning to face her with an expression of desperate intensity. There's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you from the beginning. Her heart stuttered. What? The curse, it doesn't just take my humanity. It's killing me, piece by piece. The transformations are getting more violent, more destructive. The healers estimate I have perhaps 3 more full moons before my human form can't survive the change. He cupped her face in hands that trembled slightly. This isn't just my last chance to break free, Lyra. It's my last chance to live. The admission hit her like a physical blow. 3 months. If they failed tomorrow night, if the curse remained unbroken, she would lose him forever. All the more reason to succeed, she whispered. He kissed her then, soft and desperate and tinged with goodbye. When they broke apart, she could see tears glittering in his pale eyes. I love you, he said simply. I know it's impossible, too fast, too dangerous. But whatever happens tomorrow night, I needed you to know. I love you too. The words felt like stepping off a cliff, but also like flying. And that's why we're going to break this curse. Promise me something, he said as they reached the study door. If the magic turns against us, if you see that we're both going to die, save yourself. Use whatever time is left to run. No. Lyra. No. She faced him with all the fierce determination in her artist's soul. We do this together or not at all. That's not negotiable. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Together, then. Come, let me teach you the words that might save us both. They spent the rest of the night in his study, practicing the ancient incantation until it flowed from her tongue like poetry. And as dawn crept across the horizon, Lyra realized she was no longer afraid. Tomorrow night, she would paint for love, for life, for the slim chance that art could conquer even the oldest magic. Tomorrow night, everything would change. The day of the full moon dawned gray and oppressive, with storm clouds gathering on the horizon like an omen. Lyra spent the morning in her cottage, going through her supplies one final time, organizing brushes by size and checking paint tubes for the consistency she'd need to work quickly. Tonight, there would be no time for hesitation, no opportunity to correct mistakes. She'd barely eaten anything in 3 days, her stomach too twisted with anxiety to handle more than tea and toast. But her hands were steady as she packed her materials, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought failed. She was a professional, trained for challenges that pushed the boundaries of artistic possibility. She'd just never had her life depend on the outcome before. At noon, Thorpe arrived with final instructions and what looked like a formal document drawn up by the manor's lawyers. Prince Kieran's will, the old man explained, his usually composed demeanor cracked with worry. Should the worst occur tonight, he wants you to inherit the estate. Everything, the manor, the grounds, the family fortune. He believes you understand the weight of preserving what he's built. Lyra stared at the document, hands trembling. I can't accept this. You must. Prince Kieran was very clear. If he dies tonight, it should be in service of something meaningful. Your art, your courage, he sees that as meaning enough to justify any sacrifice. She signed the papers with a hand that shook only slightly, then spent the afternoon in restless preparation. She showered, braided her hair back to keep it out of her face, and dressed in old clothes that could be ruined by paint or worse. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, she found herself standing before her bathroom mirror, staring at a woman she barely recognized. Her face was pale but determined, green eyes bright with the fever of someone about to attempt the impossible. She looked like a warrior preparing for battle, or a martyr walking toward flames. Maybe she was both. The car arrived at sunset, just as storm clouds opened to release the first fat drops of rain. She rode to Blackthorn Manor in silence, watching the countryside blur past through rain-streaked windows. Lightning flickered in the distance, and she wondered if it was coincidence or if even the weather sensed the supernatural tension building toward midnight. Thorpe met her at the manor entrance, his lined face grave. Prince Kieran is already in the tower room, preparing. He asked me to give you this. He handed her a sealed envelope. To be opened only if. I understand. She tucked the letter into her jacket pocket, not trusting herself to read whatever final words Kieran might have written. The tower room had been transformed since her last visit. Thick velvet curtains covered the windows, ready to be drawn back to leaden moonlight. The lighting equipment hummed softly, positioned to eliminate shadows that might interfere with her work. Her easel stood ready, a pristine canvas waiting to capture whatever truth she could wring from the night. And in the corner, Kieran sat on the edge of the medieval bed, already shirtless and barefoot, his wrists and ankles secured by padded iron shackles that looked strong enough to hold a wild animal. He looked up as she entered, and she caught her breath at the change in his appearance. His skin seemed to glow with an inner light, and his eyes held flecks of gold that shifted like living flame. The transformation had already begun, subtle but unmistakable. "How long do we have?" she asked, setting up her palette with hands that moved purely on instinct. "An hour, perhaps less." His voice was rougher than usual, tinged with an accent that seemed older than the one she'd grown accustomed to. "The moon is rising, and I can feel the wolf stee." Lyra arranged her brushes, squeezed paint onto her palette in careful order, and positioned herself at the easel. Through the covered windows, she could hear rain drumming against glass and thunder rolling across the hills. The storm was building toward something magnificent and terrible. "Are you ready?" Kieran asked. She looked at him, really looked, taking in every detail she would need to capture. The aristocratic lines of his face already beginning to sharpen and change. The lean muscles of his chest and shoulders, marked here and there with scars that spoke of previous transformations. The way shadows seemed to gather around him as if drawn by some supernatural magnetism. But it was his eyes that held her, pale blue shot through with gold, ancient and wild and heartbreakingly human. "I'm ready." She lifted her first brush, loaded it with paint that seemed to glow in the artificial light. "Kieran?" "Yes?" "I love you. No matter what happens tonight, remember that." His smile was radiant with hope and terror. "I love you too. Now paint, my darling artist. Paint like our lives depend on it." Outside, the moon broke through the storm clouds, sending silver light flooding through gaps in the curtains. Kieran's back arched, a sound somewhere between gasp and growl escaping his throat. The transformation was beginning in earnest now. Lyra drew back the curtains with steady hands, flooding the room with moonlight, then returned to her easel. She had perhaps 6 hours to capture the impossible, man and beast, human and wolf, love and wildness bound together on canvas. She began with his eyes. The first brushstroke felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. Paint flowed across canvas with a life of its own, guided by instinct and desperation and something that might have been magic. She painted the pale blue of his human gaze, then began weaving in threads of gold that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. Behind her, Kieran's breathing grew ragged. She could hear the chains testing their limits as his body began to change, muscles expanding and elongating in ways that defied natural law. But she didn't turn around. Couldn't afford to be distracted by the sight of the man she loved transforming into something that would kill her without hesitation. Instead, she painted. Stroke by stroke, line by line, she built his face on canvas, not as it was, but as it truly existed. Human features overlaid with the suggestion of something wilder, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She used techniques she'd never tried before, layering colors that shouldn't work together but somehow created depth and truth that took her breath away. The sound that came from behind her was no longer entirely human. Deep, rumbling, touched with predatory hunger. The wolf was rising. Time to paint the beast. The first howl shattered the night like breaking glass. Lyra's brush never paused, even as every primitive instinct screamed at her to run. She could hear Kieran, or what had been Kieran, testing the restraints within human strength. The heavy iron chains groaned under the assault, but they held. For now. She risked a glance over her shoulder and immediately wished she hadn't. The transformation was more horrific than anything her imagination could have conjured. Kieran's body had elongated, muscles rippling and expanding beneath skin that seemed to shift between human flesh and something covered in dark fur. His face was caught between forms, still recognizably him, but with a jaw that had begun to extend into a muzzle, teeth that were no longer entirely human, eyes that burned with predatory intelligence. He was magnificent and terrifying, beautiful in the way that hurricanes and avalanches were beautiful, natural forces too powerful for human comprehension. And he was looking directly at her with hunger that made her blood run cold. "Focus," she whispered to herself, turning back to the canvas. "Paint the truth." She began working on the beast's features, layering them over the human face she'd already established. Not replacing, but merging. The elongated jaw became part of his aristocratic profile. The inhuman eyes held the same soul she'd fallen in love with. The fangs were terrible, yes, but they were his fangs, part of the complete truth of what Kieran Blackthorne really was. Behind her, the sounds grew more violent. Chains rattling, deep growls that seemed to vibrate through the stone walls, the crack of wood as claws tested the bed frame. The storm outside intensified in response, lightning illuminating the tower room in stroboscopic flashes that made her work feel like something from a fever dream. Lyra. The voice was barely recognizable, deeper than Kieran's human speech, roughened by vocal cords that were no longer entirely human. Run. She didn't turn around. No. I can smell your fear. Your blood. The wolf wants to hunt. Then the wolf will have to wait. She loaded her brush with deep amber and began painting the glow she could see gathering around his transformed features. I'm not finished. A snarl answered her, followed by the sound of metal straining to its breaking point. One of the restraints gave way with a sharp crack, and she heard claws scraping against stone as one arm came free. Her hand trembled for the first time that night, leaving a smear of paint across the canvas that could have ruined everything. But instead of destroying the image, the mistake seemed to enhance it, adding a sense of movement, a barely contained wildness that perfectly captured what she was trying to convey. The chains won't hold much longer, the creature that had been Kieran growled. You should fear me. I do fear you. She began working on the background now, painting shadows that seemed to move with their own life. But I fear losing you more. The admission seemed to give him pause. For a moment, the only sounds were rain against windows and the whisper of brush against canvas. Then, quietly, in a voice that was almost human again, you're painting me. Both of me. Yes. The others, they tried to paint one or the other. Never both together. The others weren't in love with you. She stepped back to assess her work, heart racing as she realized how much she'd already accomplished. The face on the canvas was impossible and perfect, Kieran as he truly was, human and wolf existing in the same space, the same soul. How much time do I have left? Until midnight. Then the wolf will be complete, and the man. Another chain snapped. The man will be gone until dawn. She glanced at the clock. 11:15. 45 minutes to finish the painting and perform the binding ritual, with a partially transformed werewolf growing stronger and more dangerous by the minute. She could do this. She had to. Working faster now, she painted his torso, human muscle overlaid with suggestions of fur, skin that seemed to ripple between forms. She captured the way moonlight caught the silver in his dark hair, the elegant line of his throat that could speak poetry or tear out her jugular with equal ease. Every brushstroke was a prayer, a plea to whatever forces governed art and magic and love. Behind her, she could hear him fighting the remaining restraints. His breathing had become deeper, more animal-like, punctuated by sounds that no human throat could make. But underneath the beast's hunger, she could still hear traces of the man she loved. Lyra. Her name came out as half-growl, half-whisper. The painting. How does it look? She stepped back to study her work with critical eyes. The face was perfect, impossible but true, capturing both natures in a way that made her artist's soul sing with recognition. The torso was nearly complete, muscles and shadows and the suggestion of transformation caught in permanent flux. But the hands. The hands were the key, she realized suddenly. Hands that could create beauty or destroy it, that could offer comfort or deal death. If she could capture that duality, if she could paint the truth of what those hands meant. She loaded her finest brush with a mixture of colors that shouldn't work together, pale human flesh tinted with shadow and starlight, the suggestion of claws that were both weapon and extension of will. As she painted, she found herself thinking of Kieran in the garden, dirt under his fingernails as he tended roses. The same hands that now sported claws sharp enough to tear her apart. 11:30. 30 minutes. The final restraints gave way with a sharp crack that made her jump, nearly ruining the delicate work she was doing on his left hand. She could hear him rising from the bed, the whisper of bare feet on stone as he moved to test his freedom. But he didn't approach her. Not yet. The binding words, he said, voice now fully transformed into something between human speech and animal communication. Do you remember them? Every syllable. She finished the hands and began working on the final details, the play of moonlight across his skin, the way shadows gathered around him like living things, the impossible beauty that made him something more than the sum of his human and wolf natures. 11:45. 15 minutes. Lyra. His voice was closer now, perhaps only a few feet behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from his transformed body, could hear the barely controlled breathing of something that was fighting its most basic instincts. I need you to know, whatever happens in the next few minutes, whatever the wolf does. I love you. The man loves you completely. I know. She painted the final highlight, a touch of silver that made his painted eyes seem to glow with their own light. I love you too. Both of you. The clock on the mantel chimed 11:50. 10 minutes until midnight. 10 minutes until the transformation would be complete and she would be alone in a room with a creature that knew only hunger. She set down her brush and stepped back to study the finished painting. It was impossible. It was perfect. It was the most truthful thing she had ever created. Kieran Blackthorne stared back at her from the canvas, caught in the moment between human and wolf, beautiful and terrible and absolutely, completely himself. The painting seemed to pulse with its own life, as if the paint were still wet and flowing, capturing not just his appearance but his essence. It's done, she whispered. Behind her, the creature that had been her lover growled low and dangerous. Then it's time for the binding. Lyra. Whatever happens, know that you gave me the most precious gift anyone ever could. You saw me. Really saw me. She turned to face him, heart hammering against her ribs as she took in his fully transformed state. He was enormous, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb moonlight. His face was fully lupin now, elongated muzzle, pointed ears, eyes that burned like golden fire. Claws tipped his fingers, and when he smiled, she could see fangs designed for tearing flesh. He was the most beautiful monster she had ever seen. The words, she said, placing her hand flat against the wet paint of the canvas. I speak them now? Now. His voice was barely recognizable, but the love in it was unmistakable. And Lyra, if this fails, if the magic turns against us, I want you to know it was worth it. Every moment was worth it. The clock began to chime midnight. She pressed her palm against the painted face and spoke the words that might save them both. Or destroy them in the attempt. Luna testis, nox custos, audite verba mea. The ancient words flowed from Lyra's lips like music, each syllable carrying power that made the air itself seem to thicken and pulse. As her palm pressed against the wet paint of the canvas, she felt electricity arc through her body, not painful, but overwhelming, like being struck by lightning made of starlight and hope. The painting began to glow. It started as a subtle luminescence around the edges, paint that seemed to capture moonlight and hold it. But as she continued the incantation, the glow intensified, spreading across the canvas until Kieran's painted face seemed to burn with its own inner fire. Behind her, the werewolf that had been her lover threw back his massive head and howled, a sound that shattered the night and seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. But there was something different in this cry, something that spoke of recognition rather than pure animal rage. Divide animus in uno corpore habitans, audite prisum meme. The Latin came easier now, flowing from some deep place in her soul where love and desperation had burned away everything but absolute certainty. She was dimly aware of the storm outside reaching crescendo, thunder that rolled like the voice of angry gods, lightning that turned night to day in stroboscopic flashes. The painting pulsed like a living heart. And suddenly, impossibly, the painted eyes blinked. Lyra gasped but didn't break the incantation. On the canvas, Kieran's impossible face, human and wolf perfectly merged, turned to look directly at her. His painted mouth moved, speaking words she could feel rather than hear. I remember. I remember who I am. Kieran? She whispered his name without breaking rhythm, still speaking the binding words even as her rational mind reeled at what she was witnessing. Behind her, the werewolf's howls had changed, become less bestial and more anguished. Like something fighting its way back from the depths of animal consciousness. Quod homo est bestia, fiat unum. Quod divisum est, coniungator. The painted figure reached out from the canvas, its hand pressing against the inside of the two-dimensional surface as if against glass. Where paint touched living palm, magic exploded through her nervous system. She could suddenly feel everything Kieran felt, the agony of transformation, the desperate struggle to hold on to human thought while primal instinct screamed for blood, the love that blazed through both natures like an unquenchable fire. And she could feel the curse itself, ancient, malevolent magic that had fed on his family's suffering for 3 centuries. It wrapped around his soul like chains, growing stronger with each transformation, each surrender to the beast. But now those chains were beginning to crack. Per amorem verum, per artem sacram, per voluntatem liberum. The werewolf behind her roared, a sound that held both animal rage and human agony. She could hear him moving closer, massive claws scraping against stone, but she didn't turn around. Couldn't afford to break concentration when the magic was so close to completion. The painting pulsed again, and suddenly she could see through Kieran's painted eyes. The tower room from his perspective, herself standing before the easel, hand pressed against the canvas, face illuminated by the supernatural glow. And behind her, the werewolf had stopped perhaps 3 feet away, golden eyes fixed on the painting with an expression she couldn't read. Intelligence flickered in that bestial gaze, more than animal cunning, but not quite human rationality. He was fighting for control, she realized. Fighting to remember who he was beneath the curse's influence. Salvator maledictio, liberator anima, fiat homo integer. The final words left her lips just as the clock finished chiming midnight, and the world exploded into light and sound and magic beyond anything she had ever imagined. The painting erupted in golden fire that didn't burn, light that poured from the canvas like liquid starlight. It washed over her, through her, carrying images and emotions that weren't her own, 3 centuries of blackthorn princes fighting the curse, falling to it, dying in despair or madness or violent transformation. But now, for the first time in 300 years, the curse was fighting back. The werewolf behind her screamed, a sound that held every note of human anguish while still coming from a thoroughly inhuman throat. She turned to see him writhing in the moonlight, body caught between forms as the magic worked its will. Fur receded and returned, muscles contracted and expanded, his face shifted between human and wolf with nauseating speed. The painting's glow intensified, and she realized with sudden, terrifying clarity what was happening. The curse wasn't just being broken, it was being drawn out of him, pulled into the canvas where human and wolf were perfectly balanced, equally real, equally true. All the darkness, all the malevolent magic that had poisoned his bloodline for generations, was being absorbed by her painting. And if the canvas couldn't hold it all, if her artistic vision wasn't strong enough to contain 3 centuries of accumulated curse, the painting began to smoke. No, she whispered, pressing both hands against the canvas now, ignoring the heat that seared her palms. No, you don't get to win. Not now. She poured everything she had into the binding, all her love for Kieran, all her faith in the power of art to capture truth, all her stubborn determination to save the man who had trusted her with his life. The painting bucked against her hands like a living thing, trying to tear itself apart as conflicting magics warred within its confines. Behind her, Kieran's agonized cries were becoming more human. The transformation was reversing, she realized with a surge of desperate hope. The curse was being drawn out of him and into the canvas, where her painted vision could contain and neutralize it. But the strain was enormous. She could feel the magic fighting her, trying to corrupt her perfect balance of human and wolf, trying to tip the scales toward pure beast or pure man. Either would destroy the binding, would send the curse flooding back into Kieran stronger than ever. I won't let you, she snarled at the malevolent force that pressed against her consciousness like acid. He's mine now. Both sides of him. The painted Kieran looked at her with eyes full of love and terror. Lyra, you have to let go. The magic is too strong, it's going to consume the painting, and when it does, we die together. She smiled at him, pouring every ounce of her love into that expression. I told you, not negotiable. The canvas began to crack down the middle. For a heartbeat that lasted eternity, she thought they had failed. 3 centuries of curse magic was too much for any painting to contain, no matter how perfect the artistic vision. The crack widened, and she could see malevolent darkness beginning to seep out like poison. Then, impossibly, the crack began to seal. Not because the canvas was repairing itself, but because the painted Kieran was holding it together. His hands pressed against the growing fissure from inside the two-dimensional space, and where he touched, light blazed forth to push back the encroaching darkness. Together, he said, voice carrying across the boundary between art and reality. We do this together. Lyra pressed her hands harder against the canvas, feeling paint mix with blood from her seared palms. The physical pain was nothing compared to the magical strain, but she held on, pouring her will into the binding. The painted wolf and the painted man looked at each other across the impossible space of the canvas, then nodded in perfect understanding. They reached for each other, and when their hands touched, golden light exploded outward in waves that washed away 3 centuries of curse magic like debris before a tsunami. The real Kieran's scream cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence, Lyra could hear only her own ragged breathing and the softer sound of rain against windows. The supernatural storm had broken, leaving behind the gentle patter of ordinary weather. She was afraid to turn around. Afraid to see what the binding had left behind. The painting in front of her was no longer glowing, but it was whole, canvas intact, colors vibrant and true. Kieran looked back at her from within the two-dimensional space, but now his painted eyes held peace instead of torment. Human and wolf existed in perfect harmony, neither dominating the other, both equally real and equally accepted. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever created. Lyra. The voice behind her was purely human, Kieran's voice, rough with exhaustion but free of the bestial undertones that had marked his speech during transformation. She turned slowly, heart hammering with hope and terror. He knelt in the moonlight perhaps 5 feet away, naked and trembling but unmistakably, completely human. No trace of fur remained on his skin, no inhuman glow in his pale eyes. The aristocratic features she had fallen in love with were exactly as they should be, beautiful, refined, touched with exhaustion but free of the supernatural wildness that had marked him as cursed. Is it over? She whispered. He looked down at his hands, normal human hands with normal human nails, and slowly nodded. I can feel it. The wolf is still there, but it's quiet. Content. Part of me instead of a separate entity trying to tear its way out. He looked up at her with eyes bright with tears. You did it, Lyra. You saved me. She crossed to him in 3 quick strides, dropping to her knees and pulling him into her arms. He was solid and real and wonderfully, perfectly human, his skin warm against hers as she held him tight enough to convince herself this wasn't another impossible dream. We saved each other, she whispered against his hair. The painting worked because we both believed in it. Because we loved each other enough to risk everything. They held each other as dawn crept across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed impossibly beautiful after the supernatural darkness of the night. The curse was broken, the binding complete, and for the first time in 3 centuries, a Blackthorn prince was free to love and be loved without the shadow of transformation hanging over his future. But as the sun rose higher, Lyra realized their story was far from over. They had won the battle against the curse, but now they had to learn how to live with the victory. How to love each other in the bright light of day, when the romantic danger of the supernatural had been replaced by the complex reality of building a life together. Looking at the painting that had saved them both. At the impossible face that gazed back with eyes full of love and acceptance, she thought perhaps that challenge would be just as wonderful as any moonlit mystery. After all, the best art came from truth. And the truth was that she loved Kieran Blackthorne, curse or no curse, human or wolf or something beautifully in between. That truth would be enough for whatever came next. Epilogue, 1 year later. The first anniversary of their Moonlight Bargain fell on a night when the sky was clear and the full moon hung like a silver coin against velvet darkness. Lyra stood in the tower room that had once been a place of terror and transformation, now converted into the most beautiful art studio she had ever imagined. The medieval bed was gone, replaced by comfortable furniture and better lighting. The restraints had been removed, the stone walls softened with tapestries and plants that brought life to the space. But the painting remained, mounted in a place of honor where moonlight could still touch its surface. Even now, a year later, Kieran's painted face seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The perfect balance of human and wolf gazed out from the canvas with serene acceptance, a reminder of what love and art could accomplish when joined in common cause. Still admiring your masterpiece? Kieran's voice came from the doorway, warm with affection and just a trace of the otherworldly accent that marked him as something more than entirely human. She turned to find him silhouetted against the hallway light, and her heart still skipped a beat at the sight of him. The curse was broken, the wolf contained and integrated, but he remained the most beautiful man she had ever seen. Perhaps more beautiful now that the constant tension of fighting his nature had been replaced by peaceful acceptance of all he was. Our masterpiece, she corrected, moving into his arms with the easy intimacy of lovers who had faced death together and chosen life. I could never have painted it without you. And I could never have survived the binding without your love. He kissed her forehead, lips warm against her skin. Have I mentioned recently that marrying you was the best decision I've ever made? She laughed, holding up her left hand where a ring of white gold and moonstone caught the light. Their wedding had been small, held in the garden among the roses that had watched over their courtship. Thorpe had officiated, beaming with joy at seeing his young master finally free to love without fear. Only every day for the past 6 months, husband. Good. I'd hate for you to forget. He moved to the painting, studying his own impossible face with the detached interest of someone examining a historical artifact. Sometimes I still can't believe it worked. 3 centuries of curse magic, contained in canvas and paint. Art has always been magic, Lyra said, joining him before the painting. The magic of capturing truth, of making others see what you see, of creating beauty from chaos. We just made it a bit more literal than usual. On nights like this, when the moon was full, she could still sense the wolf within him. Not as a separate entity clawing for freedom, but as an integrated part of his nature. He was stronger on these nights, more graceful, his already keen senses heightened to supernatural levels. But he remained Kieran, thoughtful, gentle, aristocratic Kieran who tended gardens and collected art and loved her with a devotion that took her breath away. The curse had been broken, but some gifts of the bloodline remained. And she found she was grateful for them. The wolf's strength and senses, filtered through human wisdom and compassion, made him capable of things no ordinary man could achieve. He could track a missing child through miles of forest, could sense approaching storms days before they hit, could move with lethal grace when threats to their peaceful life occasionally arose. He was exactly what he'd always been, not fully human, but not monster either. Something beautiful and wild and perfectly himself. I finished the new series today, she said, gesturing toward a collection of canvases arranged along the far wall. The gallery in London wants to exhibit them next month. The supernatural portraits? Kieran moved to examine her latest work, and she saw his expression soften with wonder. Lyra, these are extraordinary. Each painting in the series captured a different supernatural creature, a vampire caught between human beauty and predatory hunger, a fey queen whose face held both terrible power and heartbreaking loneliness, a ghost suspended between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. They were all imaginary, products of her artistic vision rather than living subjects, but each one explored the same theme that had driven her to paint Kieran in the first place, the duality of nature, the beauty that could exist in even the most dangerous beings. They're inspired by you, she admitted. By what I learned about seeing the whole truth of someone, not just the parts that seem safe or familiar. They'll cause quite a stir. Good. Art should challenge people, make them think differently about the world around them. She moved to stand beside him, studying the paintings with a critical eye. Besides, there are more supernatural beings in the world than most people realize. Maybe it's time some of them felt seen and understood. It was true. In the year since breaking Kieran's curse, they had encountered others touched by magic, some benevolent, some neutral, a few actively malevolent. The supernatural world existed parallel to the mundane one, hidden but very real. And as word spread through that community about the artist who had painted a werewolf prince back to wholeness, they began to receive visitors. Nothing as dramatic as commissioned curse-breaking, thankfully. But supernatural beings who wanted portraits that captured their true nature, who craved the same understanding and acceptance that Lyra had given Kieran. She painted them all, vampires and fae, ghosts and shapeshifters, each one a study in the complexity of existing between worlds. Mrs. Blackthorne, Kieran said formally, offering her his arm with old-world courtesy that made her heart flutter. Would you care to join me for a moonlight walk in the garden? I believe the roses are particularly lovely tonight. I would be honored, Your Highness. She curtsied with exaggerated formality, then dissolved into giggles as he swept her into his arms for a kiss that tasted of starlight and promise. They made their way through the manor's halls, past portraits of stern ancestors whose eyes no longer seemed quite so judgmental. The curse that had shadowed the Blackthorne line for 3 centuries was broken, the family name freed from the burden of supernatural tragedy. Future generations would grow up fully human, never knowing the terror of uncontrolled transformation or the agony of losing themselves to animal instinct. But they would know the family stories. Would understand that sometimes love and art could work miracles, and that the most beautiful truths were often the most dangerous to capture. In the garden, moonflowers bloomed with ethereal beauty, releasing perfume into the night air. The fountain where stone wolves eternally hunted stone deer sparkled in the moonlight, and roses, always roses, nodded in the gentle breeze like old friends offering their blessing. Do you ever miss it? Lyra asked as they settled on their favorite bench, the one position to catch the fountain's spray and the garden's sweetest scents. The wildness, the transformation, the supernatural power? Kieran considered the question seriously, as he did all her queries about his changed nature. Sometimes, he admitted. There was a freedom in the wolf form, a simplicity of purpose that could be seductive. But the cost was too high, my humanity, my ability to love and be loved, my capacity for choice and growth. He turned to look at her, pale eyes warm with affection. What I have now is worth 1,000 nights of running wild. And what do you have now? You. The word was simple, absolute. Love. Partnership. The chance to build something meaningful with someone who sees all of me and chooses to stay anyway. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of lovers who had learned each other's rhythms. The chance to be fully myself. Human and wolf, man and monster, aristocrat and wild thing, without having to choose between them. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the fountain and the night sounds of the garden. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called to its mate, and the sound seemed to echo the contentment that filled Lyra's heart. This was what they had fought for during that terrible, wonderful night in the tower room. Not just breaking the curse, but creating the possibility of this, ordinary moments made extraordinary by love, peaceful evenings that were precious precisely because they had nearly lost the chance to share them. I love you, she said quietly, not because the moment demanded it but because the words were as natural as breathing. I love you too. He kissed her temple, lips warm against her skin. Thank you, Lyra Blackthorne. For seeing me, for saving me, for choosing to build a life with me even when it meant risking everything. Thank you for trusting me to paint your truth. She leaned into his embrace, perfectly content to spend the rest of the night in his arms beneath the watching moon. For letting me capture the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And what was that? A soul brave enough to love despite being broken. A heart strong enough to choose hope over despair. A man willing to risk everything for the chance to be whole. Above them, the full moon sailed across the star-scattered sky, no longer a herald of transformation and terror but simply a beautiful celestial body that blessed their garden with silver light. In the tower room, the painting that had saved them both glowed softly with residual magic, a masterpiece born of love and desperation that would endure long after its creators had joined the ancestors whose portraits lined the manor's halls. And in the garden of Blackthorn Manor, a werewolf prince and his artist wife held each other close and planned the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life they would build together in the light of many moons to come. Their moonlight bargain had been paid in full. The rest was just love.